Hello, everybody. Good morning and welcome to the third session of this course on Indian travel writing. And I will discuss today with you, after having discussed the definitions of travel writing and the presence of factuality and selfhood within it. Today, we will talk about the ideology of travel writing and its implications with the empire, imperialism, and the emergence of what I will call a post-colonial perspective within travel writing itself. So it's going to be a journey to look at how travel writing creates the other for the self, and how it negotiates with the other, and how travel writing as a form has been implicated in this entire political trajectory of colonialism and imperialism. In the process, of course, I will lay out certain theoretical maps for you. These theoretical maps will include two very important texts. One which most of you already know, Said's Orientalism, and I'll discuss the importance of Said's Orientalism within the rubric of travel writing. The other text, which relatively is unknown to many of you, is Mary Louise Pratt, whose terminology and insights into travel writing, I think, provide some of the most important clues for understanding the ideologies of travel writing. So it's going to be an exciting journey, and I hope that we will slowly plod through these areas of theory. Now, travel writing in itself is engaged in a slight process of othering from its very inception, since every travel account somehow or the other is premised on the assumption that it brings news and territories, places that are unfamiliar and unknown to the audience. Although there are, of course, travel narratives which write about known familiar zones, the impulse of reading travel writing is primarily to satisfy one's knowledge of the unknown. Now, therefore, there are certain strategies that the travel writer will, of course, use, in the sense that he will try and describe the territory, therefore the geographies, the maps, the cultures, and very often, as I said, move through a principle of association, through similes, for example, which will somehow underline attempts to make similar, yet foreground ways of making dissimilar as well. Right? So familiarity and dissimilarity, right? These are elements which will go into the making of travel writing itself. So a degree of otherness is already, built into the genre. But when that otherness sort of tries to look at issues of race, for example, tries to look at prejudices, ethnocentric attitudes, and seeks to judge and evaluate the other in terms of the qualitative standard of the self, it is there that the politics of travel writing starts to encroach upon the form. So, what is the emotional content that travel writing is trying to generate? Is it fear? Is it envy? Is it revulsion? Is it incomprehension? Is it despair? How does travel writing sort of define and seek to frame the other? What are the moral, racial standards of judgment of the other? These are the questions that go into the what we will call the ideology of travel writing. So, you know, it will argue, of course, then that any representation, and if you take the Foucauldian idea, any representation has underlying power structures assumed within it. And however much the travel writer might try to overcome or ignore these power structures, uh, the representational strategies will very often, overflow and reveal these ideological motivations. So this is what the ideology of travel writing is. How does one represent? What is the politics of that representation? What are the standards by which the representation is judged? And what are the fulfillments, or what are the reader's assumptions that the travel writer is trying to, as it were, satisfy? Now, of course, you will understand that 1600, when the East India Company starts its ventures in terms of trade, and in the early half of travel writing, there is strangeness and wonder, of course, but there is not that degree of ideological motivation, in the sense that engagement is not to that extent. Although, this marks the beginning of the medieval, and the early modern marks the beginnings of this framing of the discourse of the ideology of travel writing in terms of considering the other as unfamiliar. And by the other, I mean the entire rest of the world, for example, China or Egypt or India or Africa or the Americas. And gradually, this dissimilarity then is evaluated in terms of power. Now, with the deepening of colonialism, and you can see already that by the 1720s, when Defoe is writing, there is already an attempt to see the territory through a certain lens of power and conquest. If Defoe can say, I'm the monarch of all I survey, that is the, as it were, gaze through which the traveler is looking at the alien landscape. And therefore, the entire culture of that territory must be mapped. The entire geography must be mapped so as to suit this conquest, gaze of conquest and commerce, especially with the advent of colonial and capitalist travel. So just as in the sense individualism is seen as possessive individualism, thereafter all territory now becomes fair game. And it is therefore now that the representation of the other needs to be calibrated so that the conquest and transformation of the territory can be legitimized in that sense of the term. Now, how does this legitimization occur is something that Said lays out in his 1978 book titled Orientalism. Now, all of you are familiar with it. Nevertheless, I'm trying to look at, how Orientalism can be read through the prism of travel writing itself. Now, Said, of course, talks about travel writing as an integral part of the Western imaginative framing of the Orient. You will remember, of course, that it is not the Orient really that is being framed. It is the perspective of the West that is being framed through Orientalism. And Said, of course, uses the term discourse. And the word that he uses here, of course, is very interesting: regularized collectivity. And talks about discourse as being the cumulative archive of knowledge and imagery, which comes to shape a culture's attitudes and assumptions on a given topic. So, both Said and Foucault are talking about discourse in terms of the collective and how a particular culture and a group of cultures look at alternative cultures or frame alternative cultures so that the same stereotype is reiterated over and over again. So, Orientalism is for Said a discourse in Western culture which has consistently worked to construct a singular Orient as the antithesis of a supposedly more enlightened West. And it is here, you see, that travel writing becomes very important. Now, before I move on to the construct of the Orient, it is also interesting to look at beyond the Orient, the ways in which Africa, for example, has been constructed in terms of the West. And I would like to talk about the one of the texts which we've heard of, especially with reference to Dr. Livingstone, is Henry Morton Stanley's great bestseller of 1878, Through the Dark Continent, where Stanley is talking about Africa. And Stanley moves with a huge retinue of porters, guides, and he moves from Zanzibar in the Indian Ocean to the lakes Victoria and Tanganyika in East Africa. And then he follows the Congo River to reach the Atlantic coast of Africa, a humongous journey that he undertakes. Now, this is by itself not an imperial quest as such, because Stanley is, as it were, the innocent traveler traveling through the land. But the data he collects becomes immensely useful to future colonial projects. And the assumptions and the framing of Africa as the dark continent, and also Africa as a source of wealth, is very pronounced. So he reports, Stanley does, on valuable artifacts of commerce. He talks about establishing a great trading port on Lake Victoria, where trade in ivory, sheep, goats may happen. He talks about fabrics, and then therefore engages in looking at Africa not in terms of a land of people, but in terms of a land of opportunities. So nature, human resources, space becomes framed in an imaginative geography of commerce and conquest. Now, what Stanley, of course, does is periodically reinforce again the primitive state of Africa, savagery and barbarism. These are, of course, adjectives that I'm quoting from Stanley. He talks about repeatedly the senseless hate and ferocity which appear to animate the primitive aborigines. So you can see the kind of framing of Africa in terms of primitivity, hatred, and violence. Now, he also talks about the monstrosities of the different practices, and thereafter, he uses very characteristic adjectives like filthy, vulturous, ghouls that he talks about, the perverse cannibals, and the insensate savages. Therefore, what Stanley is deliberately constructing over and over again in the narrative is two kinds of civilizations. One, which is progressive, scientific, less superstitious, peaceful apparently. The other is primitive. The other is marked by violence. The other is marked by a lack of science. And the other is marked by a lack of any kind of sophistication in that sense of the term. Therefore, it is in this way that you see travel writing creates certain stereotypes, and further travel writing further reiterates these stereotypes, so that the discourse upon discourse makes travel writing frame the other in a certain way in which it can be judged in terms of racial alterity, It can be judged in terms of civilizational alterity. It can be, infantilized. It can be exoticized, and it can be brutalized in that sense of the term. Now, let me therefore, move on from Stanley to what Said has to say about Orientalism. And Said talks about, if you remember, Orientalism as a discipline by which the Orient was systematically approached as a topic of learning, discovery, and practice. So you see, the operative word for us today here is discovery. How is the Orient discovered? And how is the Orient learned? And this is where, Said talks about a style of thought which is both ontological and marked by an epistemological distinction. And this epistemological distinction, I would argue, is to a large extent done by the travel writers. If you look at Orientalism as a volume, you will see that Said divides it into three major parts. The first, he talks about the capacity of Orientalism, a discourse that has been in existence for 2 centuries and that continues in the present. This is 1978. And how, the Orient is homogenized as a space which is marked by despotism, sensuality, Oriental modes of production, and Oriental splendor. So you see, repeatedly, images of despotism in terms of political backwardness, sensuality, the Orient framed as a different kind of a body, the Oriental modes of production, once again, primitive and non-modern, and Oriental splendor, a kind of feudal, despotic society as opposed to the progressive Occidental society. Now, Said, of course, suggests that this upsurge in Orientalist study coincides with European expansion from the late, 18th century to the modern age. And he talks about, the Napoleonic invasion of Egypt in 1798. And if you remember that Napoleon, when he's running through these territories, following him is a group of Orientalists who's taking up, the discoveries. They're taking up the artifacts. They are sort of cataloging it, archiving it, and attempting to describe the civilization. Those of you who've been to the British Museum will remember how, the Rosetta Stone was one of the artifacts discovered during this entire process. Therefore, Orientalism ultimately becomes a kind of a political division, a political vision of reality, rather, where you see whose structure is promoting the difference between the familiar self, West, us, versus the strange, Orient, East, them, right? Therefore, it's an elaborate web of power that is being sort of created. Now, how this is done scientifically, of course, Pratt will talk about a little later, and I'll come to that in a moment. Now, then Said moves on to this issue of Orientalist structuring and restructuring. And he talks about philology, history, and the creative writers. And then in the last part, he talks about modern Orientalism, where he shifts the onus onto America and the ways in which, the legacies of British and French Orientalism have been carried on by the United States. Now, therefore, Said will finally, talk about the Orient as in terms of the metaphor of a theater, and he will write that on this stage will appear figures whose role it is to represent the larger whole from where they emanate. The Orient then seems to be, according to Said, not an unlimited extension beyond the familiar European world, but rather a closed field, a theatrical stage affixed to Europe. And therefore, the Orientalist will share with magic and mythology the self-containing, self-reinforcing character of a closed system. in which objects are what they are because they are what they are for once for all time for ontological reasons that no empirical material can either dislodge or alter. So this entire process of framing is done by discourse which is compiling one upon the other. So we refer to that collectivity of discourse formation. And travel writing, according to Said, becomes important with literature, political tracts, journalistic texts, religious and philological studies. Travel writing is an integral part of this discourse formation. Now, it is interesting, that, of course, Said has the problem that Said's, Orientalist paradigm, as it were, the paradigm of Orientalism, creates only a homogeneous mode of representation. But if you look at Stanley, for example, and if you look at, the European travelers who traveled to India, you will find that there are certain very carefully manufactured stereotypes that are provided. The Hindu, for example, is seen as superstitious, crafty, and unfit. The Muslim, on the other hand, even if he's masculine, is shown to be, feudal, is shown to be full of a lot of prejudices, and therefore all Indian religions, as opposed to Christianity, are seen as, in terms of regression, in terms of primitivism. Similarly, you see, this entire Indian society, Oriental society, is seen in terms of the feminine, something which is essentially powerless, something which is essentially emasculated, whereas you have Western society, which is masculine and virile. If you remember, when Defoe goes to his island, there's no woman as there. The island is the woman. And Said, of course, talks about another category, which I think most of you will find very useful, is Orientalism creates, imaginative geographies. So the land, the culture is not defined really in terms of what they are, but in what terms they are perceived by the Western travelers. Therefore, the traveler will only therefore travel to certain places. And this stereotype is, as it were, even now it goes on. You see, a Western tourist, when he comes to India, will go to a few sites. If you look at the sites that he will go to, it's probably Rajasthan where he will go to see the forts and the ancient India of the Mughal rule. He will, of course, go to Banaras, where he will try and find the spiritual roots of India. So these are certain reified stereotypes which the Orientalist discourse, as it was framing India into. Therefore, you see, it's very interesting in the way that these travel writings therefore created certain sites which the tourist industry over and over again sort of emphasized, thereby creating, the magical fakir, for example. If you look at, your Tintin stories, the Blue Lotus, and so on and so forth, you will find that the Chinese are seen as, opium addicted, very extremely, indolent people. The Indian is described in terms of either the guide or the Sherpa, who is unlettered, as it were. Therefore, time and time again, this discourse creates the other as, defined in terms of non-modernity, non-masculinity. And therefore, one of the very important sites, therefore, becomes this entire issue of the Indian woman. So, for example, the description of the sati, or the description of the parda, or the description of the Andar Mahal, as it were, repeatedly stresses that this is a non-modern society. In the case of Africa also, the voodoo, the kind of practice of cannibalism, which, Defoe is highlighting in his fictions, frames the other in terms of non-modernity, in terms of non-scientific categories. Therefore, this is the way in which travel writing represents. So when we talked about in the last class, we talked about facts, and we talked about the ways in which the travel writer selects the material which he sort of tries to depict. Now, he brings with him also his own, and this is something which Amartya Sen talks about, his own positionality, right? His own gaze. And this gaze is not individual, you see. This gaze is conditioned by prior discourses, prior assumptions of his own cultural superiority, from which he measures the inferiority and the difference of the culture that he's traveling to. Now, Said's, of course, ideas have been taken ahead by Ali Behdad, for example, and Behdad also talks about Homi Bhabha and the ways in which principles of discontinuity operate in representations. There are also other works which talk about the rhetorical modes of writing about non-Western people. For example, Spur talks about discursive mechanisms of surveillance, appropriation, debasement, negation, eroticization, and aestheticization. Let me repeat that. Surveillance, that the travel writer engages in, appropriation, debasement, which is a very popular strategy of travel writing, negation, in terms of dismissal, eroticization, very importantly, the Orient, as it were, or the non-West is a body of promiscuity, a body of unbridled sexuality. Now, that is something, of course, in terms of many neo-colonial strategies also operate. For example, the way in which very often metropolitan Indian people look at, say, marginalized cultures of the tribes of the Aboriginal people as eroticized and aestheticized. Therefore, you see, this entire project of Orientalism involved a kind of attempt to know, frame, control, map, and therefore to rule. So beneath the impulses of travel, the record of the travel, and the circulation of the travel lies a more insidious and more utilitarian vision of control and manipulation. Now, Edmund Burke, when he was writing in approximately 1800, was talking about, and this is one of my favorite quotes, he talks about the map of mankind unrolled before the European, and there is no territory in the world which is unknown to him. And therefore, the territory is available as a blank slate on which, a process of erasure, a process of transformation can take place. Now, what and how does this transformation take place is what Mary Louise Pratt talks about. And this is which brings me to the second important theorist whom I am using in today's class. I can talk about X number of theorists, but I'm taking two very important paradigms. Said, of course, is one, and the other is Mary Louise Pratt, whose book Imperial Eyes remains one of the most fundamental, introductions and gateways into the way in which travel writing operates. Now, the book Imperial Eyes was, of course, first published in 1992 and is titled Travel Writing and Transculturation. So we are going to look at a few terms that Pratt is coining specifically for the genre of travel writing. Remember, Said is talking about more in terms of culture, but the focus of Pratt's book is distinctly travel writing. And therefore, I would like to use a few terms, and I'd like you also to understand and use these terms when you talk about travel writing as such. So, what are the questions that Pratt raises before us? Pratt asks, how has travel and exploration writing produced the rest of the world for European readerships at particular points in Europe's expansionist trajectory? How has it produced Europe's differentiated conceptions of itself in relation to something it became possible to call the rest of the world? How do such signifying practices encode and legitimate the aspirations of economic expansion and empire? Right. So, how has the ideology been framed, and how has that ideology been justified? But Pratt does not stop here. She also asks, how has the colonized responded to such, discourses, as it were? Now, the first major term that Pratt talks about is that with the rise of scientific learning, and you remember in the last class we had talked about how the Royal Society, established in the 1660s, was consciously taking an interest in travel writing and the circulation of knowledge and the accumulation of knowledge within itself, within Europe's learning systems. Now, this Pratt defines as the planetary consciousness of Europe. The planetary consciousness of Europe. And Pratt talks about, for example, the voyages of Linnaeus, who was looking at the flora and the fauna of the globe in terms of understanding the various kinds of vegetation that were present in the entire globe, as it were. So no longer is Europe looking at merely itself. It is seeking to bring back this entire gamut of knowledge through exploration and thereby process it. Now, yesterday, of course, I talked about Bruno Latour and Latour's idea of how these different data points sourced from parts of the world is brought into the scientific calculus, and thereafter imperial strategies can be framed. So this is the planetary consciousness that Pratt is talking about. Now, Pratt then talks about another concept called the contact zone. What is the contact zone? This is probably the most fundamental term that Pratt uses. And you need to be very specific in defining this contact zone. The contact zone for Pratt, and I'm referring to her, and I'm quoting her actually, is the space of colonial encounters, the space in which peoples geographically and historically separated come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relations, usually involving conditions of coercion, radical inequality, and intractable conflict. I will repeat it for your convenience, although I will circulate this book later on, is that it refers to the space of colonial encounters, the space in which people geographically and historically separated, so geographically, historically, and therefore culturally separated, come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relations. So the moment when Crusoe comes in contact with Friday, creates that contact zone. But this contact zone is not an innocent exchange. This contact zone, Pratt says, is marked by a very definite position of power. What is this position of power? The positions of power are asymmetrical, in the sense that Crusoe has his guns, he saves Friday, puts his foot on Friday's head, and sort of demands subjugation and calls himself master. So you see, this is what I would mean by the term asymmetrical contact zones, involving conditions, what Pratt says, of coercion, radical inequality, and intractable conflict. Now, Pratt suggests that very often, contact zone and colonial frontiers might be confused, but the contact zone is more or less involved with the spatial and temporal co-presence of subjects previously separated, as Pratt says, by geographic and historical disjunctures. So that's the contact zone, where different cultures come into contact, historically and geographically separated, and also in terms of asymmetrical conditions of power. So the first term that I used was planetary consciousness. The second term that not I used, Pratt used, but I'm sort of asking you to follow, is the second term that I'm using is contact zone. And the third term that Pratt uses, and this is very, very interesting, is anti-conquest. Right. Now, we've been talking about colonialism as a process of conquest. But if you look at the travel writings, he says that this term anti-conquest refers to the strategies of representation whereby European bourgeois subjects seek to secure their innocence in the same moment as they assert European hegemony. So the European does not come in to impose his hegemony very obtrusively. Rather, it is a very hidden, insidious agenda. Consider the case of European missionaries, for example, who came under the garb of anti-conquest, but whose real aim was to assert European hegemony while posing as innocent. Because and this, Pratt says, is characteristic of travel and exploration writings, because the strategies of innocence are constituted in relation to older imperial rhetoric. And the figure of this anti-conquest, Pratt says, is the seeing man rather than the man of action, rather than somebody like Robert Clive. It is rather somebody who's observing, the traveler, whose imperial eyes passively look out and possess. So the traveler, for Pratt, is not an innocent looker. His gaze is marked by the imperial gaze, passively looking out and possessing. Now, a third term, or rather a fourth term, you see, is therefore autoethnography. But before I come to autoethnography, let me go back to this term called transculturation that Pratt uses. Now, Pratt talks about transculturation as a process through which the colonizer and the colonized, when they come in the contact zone, is fundamentally transformed. So it is, as it were, Pratt is suggesting that this process of exchange, or that process of the encounter, is never unidirectional. Right? The process is never unidirectional. Although the Colonized is irrevocably changed by this process of, as it were, acculturation. Even the colonizer undergoes a process of change. Therefore, uh, transculturation, Pratt says, is a definition of how subordinated or marginal groups select and invent from materials transmitted to them by a dominant or metropolitan culture. While subjugated people, Pratt writes, cannot readily control what emanates from the dominant culture, they do determine to varying extents what they absorb into their own and what they use it for. Transculturation is a phenomenon of the contact zone. Let me explain. So, contact zone is a place where cultures come, geographical and historical differences come into contact with each other. People who are the self and the other, people who are different. And this is marked by an asymmetry. So, this is marked by differentiated power structures where obviously the colonizer has a far greater agency, as it were. What does Pratt say? Pratt says that normally this could have just meant acculturation. So everything of the colonizer's culture passes on to the colonized. This is an ideal situation for the colonizer. Think about Friday. Crusoe names him, Crusoe obliterates his religion, Crusoe obliterates his language, and there is a situation where he seeks to send Friday to his own land, and Friday says, why are you casting me off? At the end of Robinson Crusoe, when Crusoe is describing his island people with various others, he talks about the Portuguese, who is a Catholic, Friday's father, who's a pagan, but when he comes to Friday, he refers to Friday as a Protestant. So Friday has become, as it were, to borrow a phrase from Naipaul, a complete mimic man. Now, obviously, you can see the shades of Bhabha somewhere lurking in the background. I'll come to Bhabha in a minute. But what does Pratt say? Pratt says that when this contact zone is operative, the colonized do not take everything. Of course, his power structures are limited, but he absorbs, selects, and invents from materials transmitted to him by the metropolitan culture certain aspects. He does not take all of it. Take, for example, the Indian interaction with the British. While they took the discourse of science, there was a resistance to this discourse about the Andar Mohon, the region of the home, where substantial, engagement, selection was made, and only certain aspects were taken. Now, this, of course, this concept of transculturation, you will relate with the notion of the third space by Bhabha. And Bhabha, when he talks about this third space between the first space, that of the colonizer, and the second space of the colonized, it does not superimpose upon one another unilaterally. Bhabha says that the colonizer has the ability to translate what is being sent to him. So there is a certain resistance, there is a certain acceptance, and therefore this is almost akin with this process of transculturation. Now, of course, Pratt is not merely talking about the colonial process, he's also talking about the post-colonial process also, where you see this entire contact zone also happens between the metropolitan culture and the marginalized subaltern cultures. So, transculturation contact zones are not merely colonial phenomenon, they are well extended into, independent colonized societies, and therefore these terms become equally valid for them. The last term that I'd like to talk about here is autoethnography. Now, the term transculturation, Pratt has borrowed from ethnography. Ethnography is the process of knowing, the self knowing the other. The colonizer, who is the ethnographer, attempts to map, attempts to define the culture, and attempts to know, as it were, through travel writing. Very often, you will remember Clifford Geertz and his thick descriptions as very important strategies through which travel writing and ethnography interact with each other. But there is also something called autoethnography. And this is where, I am gradually coming to my text of Abu Talib, where I will be using Pratt in a very, very big way. Right. And Pratt suggests that autoethnography or autoethnographic expression is practiced by the colonized. So, we've been talking about Western models of travel writing, but it's for the first time really that I'm coming to the indigenous Indian modes of travel writing. What happens when the Indian the colonized uses or starts to write in terms of the register of the colonizer, right? So how does he express himself? How does he respond to the ethnographic representations of himself? And this Pratt calls auto or self-ethnography, autoethnography. How does Pratt define autoethnography? He defines autoethnography as instances in which the colonized subjects undertake to represent themselves in ways that engage with the colonizer's own terms. I repeat, instances in which colonized subjects undertake to represent themselves in ways that engage with the colonizer's own terms. So, one of the classic examples of this is nationalism, and the way in which, the sense of nationalism is not existent within the Indian subcontinent was provided by the British. And the Indians themselves used this discourse of nationalism to challenge the Western discourses altogether. Again, if the Westerner has dismissed certain Indian practices of culture as completely irrational and thereby discarded them as primitive, using these structures or using Western logic to counter and show how these structures were valid for a particular condition is what autoethnography will do. So when, Abu Talib will be discarded really as or dismissed in terms of a Muslim whose religion is not progressive, Abu Talib will be using Western discourses of rationality to prove how the Muslim religion is rational. So we'll take these issues when we take Abu Talib altogether with us, and we will see how, in the first two texts at least that you have, you will be using Pratt's thesis of contact zones, Rabindranath coming in contact with the Western culture, as it were, on its first trip, expressions of transculturation, where, he is changed, but he's also trying to write back in his own terms, or on his own terms, in terms of autoethnography, and Abu Talib doing the same. Now, of course, this is extended, that colonialism does not end once, societies become independent or shrug off political dominion. The ways in which these stereotypes are often, very often reified in our own writings can be seen in the work of Frantz Fanon, in the ways in which, white skins and black masks, or rather black skins and white masks, are used, in the sense that even today when we travel to certain spaces, we characterize, certain cultures with very broad sweeping generalizations, marking difference and trying to impose our own superiorities. The Bengali tourist would be a very good example. And we'll look at, Vishwanath Ghosh's texts, where certain of these sort of assumptions and stereotypings will filter through in his writings. So then, between Said and Pratt, we have certain very important phrases. We recognize that travel writing is not just, a genre by itself. It's part of a larger system of discourse. We see how travel writing is a frame through which certain paradigms of civilization are being articulated, framed, and continuously recycled, so that a certain system of knowledge is, as it were, erected within which, the Oriental can be placed. Right? We've seen from Bhabha how this attempt to create or transform colonial societies into mirror images is resisted through third spaces, where there is a translation and a rewriting of cultures, where there's a kind of an appropriation and a rejection. Pratt, of course, talks about, travel as creating contact zones where asymmetrically distributed, powered cultures come into contact with each other. And very often this is done within the innocent guise of travel within this system of anti-conquest. And then there is a transculturation where the colonized accept and reject certain strategies of the colonizer and create their own systems of writing, which Pratt talks about in terms of autoethnography. And it is therefore within the Indian travel narratives that these autoethnographic expressions make their presences felt. But remember once again that we will today also argue that while we talk about autoethnography and the colonized responses, there are always dangers in both Said and Pratt of falling into the trap of the generalized, of generalizations. So the way in which I might articulate my autoethnography will not be exactly the way in which a person from a different class or a caste might articulate his or her own autoethnography or gender. So we'll also have to be very careful about a third term, which I'm borrowing once again from Amartya Sen, is this concept of positionality. Is my situatedness in class, caste, gender, which is part and parcel of the Indian condition, from which the filter of my looking, my gaze, is, as it were, framed in the act of travel. Now, what I'm therefore trying to suggest is that travel writing is never innocent. It is always implicated within discourses of power, and that within these contact zones, representations are often marked not by individual choices, but by received discourses. And these received discourses are very often, continued and sort of stamped, so that, one travel text, despite its uniqueness, merges into another, right? Finally, I'm arguing that in terms of reception, that when this travel text, or this not so innocent travel text, which seeks to sort of project a kind of aura of non-conquest, anti-conquest, being innocent, just looking, but in that sense mapping, charting out, creating imaginative geographies, sort of transmits this to the colonized sift, accept, reject, select, and try and write themselves within the language of the colonizer, within the discourses of the colonizer, but subtly alter, resist, challenge these discourses. And this is what Pratt means when she refers to as autoethnography. So these terms then become the theoretical prism through which I shall be looking at travel writing, at the texts of travel writing in my next classes. Now, I would just like to add one small thing here before I end, that, you know, while this has been the pattern of colonial travel writing, which sort of continued till the modern period, you know, the postmodern and the post-colonial period has seen the rise of certain post-colonial travelers who are much more articulate, who are much more conscious of the conditions of societies which have been ravaged by colonialism. So, me as an Indian, when I travel to West Indies, am I more conscious of the ways in which colonialism has stereotyped and has dominated the West Indian scenario? Therefore, when I'm writing about the West Indian culture, will I be more sensitive and more attuned, politically conscious? Now, there has been, therefore, this kind of a travel writing, which has become much more sensitive to how Western colonialism has altered colonial societies, and therefore there is a kind of association, a kind of sympathy, an altered gaze through which, you know, when these societies mutually travel amongst themselves, these colonized societies, they create a more nuanced, more sympathetic, more understanding system of travel writing, where, you know, representation, judgment, and mobility are, as it were, challenged in that sense of the term. Now, a good example of this would probably be Jamaica Kincaid, and say people, Indian travelers like Vikram Seth and Amitav Ghosh. Now, Amitav Ghosh, when he travels to Egypt, for example, will also look at the ways and identify the ways in which, you know, Egyptian society has been ravaged by colonialism, and therefore understand and sympathize with the the practices of Egyptian society. So judgment, moralization, stereotyping, therefore, will be significantly lesser, and critiques of colonial history are offered in these post-colonial travel writings. So these are some of the issues which you might see that, you know, more post-colonial travel writing, which is written by non-Europeans, traveling to unfamiliar territories, might be much more ideologically less motivated, might be more nuanced, might be more empathetic, and therefore a new travel writing is probably emerging, where, you know, travel writing is not so ideologically loaded. The other thing to understand is that with the rise of the thesis of cosmopolitanism and globalization, you know, an alternative school of travel writing is probably emerging, where instead of differences between societies, similarities between societies might be looked at. But what is a problem is that this new cosmopolitanism is also marked by the presence of globalization, and thereby strategies of neo-colonization, where this concept of, you know, a new cosmopolitanism might actually be a strategy of new anti-conquest thinking. So these are some of the complexities within travel writing and ideology within the history of travel writing. But we have gradually traced how colonialism, Europe, and travel writing was integrally related, how travel writing was implicated in the ideology of colonialism, how contact zones have been formed, and how the politics of travel writing has moved from ethnography to transculturation and autoethnography. It is within this framework that I will later on discuss specifically the history of Indian travel writing. But for now, I will stop here with the promise that in the next class, we will take a look at travel writing and gender. That will be the subject of the next class. So I'll stop here. And now I would like to take your questions. Prerona then says, is a contact zone created when Prospero and Caliban come in contact in the tempest? Of course it does. And you remember, Caliban's complaint that, you taught me language and all I know is how to curse. So, the same kind of strategy that, Crusoe and Friday have is evident within Prospero and Caliban. But you see, the point is that, literary texts, when they create these kinds of contact zones, very often try to create utopian contact zones. For example, the Friday-Crusoe relationship is one where, Friday is, the ultimate colonized, who is docile, obedient, and who takes, Crusoe as his god. Caliban is slightly more problematic because he's also, in certain ways, a figure of misrule who can disrupt. And therefore, within Caliban, of course, the problematics of the contact zone become much more evident. Thank you for pointing that out. Shamarpon asks, though pilgrimage and conquest are both travels, but from the perspective of broadening the self are totally polarized, pilgrimage being aimed at self-broadening, whereas conquest attempts to change the other. I'm not really very sure, you see, with this element of what you say pilgrimage. In many ways, if you look at the pilgrimages, and I'm talking about the Indian context, if you take a look at the ways in which the cult of Shiva has emerged in India, you see, various pilgrimage sites have been taken over in certain ways by the Brahminical religions, as it were, so that what was earlier a kind of a very local god has become a kind of a more pan-Indian kind of a pilgrimage site. And one does not forget, of course, that around with pilgrimages comes this concept of missionary activity as well. So once you have the establishment of a missionary spot and a kind of a church and a kind of a relic, then you have a pilgrimage which sort of brings in the influx of more and more missionaries and more ways in which conquests might operate. You see, you will have to remember that Crusoe, when he establishes himself on the island, is both the missionary as well as the conqueror. The conqueror in terms of territory and the missionary in terms of purifying the soul of Friday. So I will not see them as polar opposites. I would rather see that very often in terms of you can say in terms of strategizing imperialism, religion and the pilgrimage and the conquest and the exploration have gone hand in hand. After all, the first voyage to the Americas was by the Pilgrim Fathers. So, and that, look where it ended up in America. So, and what happened to the American Indians. So, I wouldn't really take pilgrimage with that kind of innocence which you would ascribe to it. And the history of colonization has always seen, religion as an appendage of, as it were, conquest. Right. Modhurima asks me, while talking about autoethnography, did the female subjects of the colonies behave differently? Thank you, Modhumita, for that comment. In fact, Pratt, I sort of ignored Pratt's major thesis there because I've reserved it in my, bow, quiver of arrows to be released tomorrow. So I'll come back to your question, I guess, tomorrow and answer this. So just keep that question on hold. That's a very intelligent question that you've asked. But let me try and answer that tomorrow. Answering that today would be probably premature, and it would, given the time that I've already spent, would be doing very great injustice to that very good question. I will come to, you mentioned Ghore Baire, of course. I'll come back to this entire question about gender and travel writing. So what happens within colonization, and what happens to the gendered perspective of travel across different ages, is something which I'll take up tomorrow. Shamarpan says that Foucault mentions every representation as an underlining power structure. Can we, some cases, find power structures in travels? Not some cases, in many cases. In most cases, pilgrimages are very often dominated by power structures. And you will find that, in terms of conquest also, what happens is that a person conquers a particular territory, and very often in our histories we see establishes a kind of a temple there, which then becomes, as it were, the site of pilgrimages, and thereby creates a power structure where the earlier power structures are erased and a new power structure is created. So of course pilgrimages are never to be seen merely in terms of very innocent religious efforts. There are, of course, very significant gendered structures of pilgrimages, which we maybe after the course is over, or after I've discussed the entire group of texts, we might talk about. But if you take a look at the pilgrimage text, and I am sorry I could not incorporate that in your syllabus this time around because too many texts would lead to cluttering, but the pilgrimage is something which demands a lot of critical attention in the way it sort of is liberational in terms of class structures, as it were, but very often it leads to newer and more insidious power structures. Lokhinarayan has a question for us where he asks, in sense of a contact zone, Othello is also there, a commander who comes from his African lineage, considered as an outsider, stranger. Of course, but remember that we are talking about travel writing here, so I will not go into these discussions of Othello and Prospero to a greater extent. But you see, a more profound example would probably be somebody like Orunoko, who arrives in England as the other, and in terms of the ways in which both Orunoko and Friday are described in terms of Europeans, they are, as it were, the noble savages. The noble savage, of course, is one of the tropes which is created in this process of formation of the or the other. The noble savage is almost always described in terms of an European. So even Othello, when you look at the Othello as the noble Moor, the valiant Moor, the savage who possesses certain European kind of qualities of masculinity, of a kind of a particular racial feature, despite his skin being black. So there are many ways, you see, in which the other is framed. It's not just one uniform way of framing the other, but there are many stereotypes within which he operates. But there is one crucial emphasis on difference. Right? Can we see travel writing from the perspective of the colonized? Of course, that's what the autoethnography is doing, and that's what this course is also all about. Because when you see Rabindranath, for example, or Abu Talib is looking at Europe, it is a reverse gaze, as it were. It is an autoethnography. It is where the Abu Talib is not only looking at Europe, he's also looking at himself vis-a-vis Europe in that sense of the term. So if a travel narrative written from the perspective of Friday, what would be that approach? Although, yes, you are probably talking out of context. But you see, one of the things which you remember, Lokhi, when we had discussed Robinson Crusoe in class, was to see the numerous, Robinsonades, which have described the novel from the perspective of Friday, novels, films. And you'll remember, of course, coexist foe, where the novel is described not in terms of Friday, but in terms of the absent woman in Crusoe's voice. So yes, of course, this has. And I mentioned Jamaica Kincaid because you see that's a very good example of how Jamaica Kincaid's travel sort of bring out the vitriol, the kind of vigor with which she criticizes the ways in which Europe has completely decimated and in many cases prejudiced certain perceptions of the other. So yes, it is very important to understand that travel writing is not an innocent form, is not just we are talking about this question of the self. And you see, the self in these travel writings is a masculine, European, white self. So what happens when this narrative is received? You see, there are two receptions here. One, the reception in the home country, and for which primarily the writer is writing. There's also the reception once the contact zone is established within the country of the other, and how other can realize how he's being framed and how the other can write back against this particular framing. You see, both these texts of Rabindranath and, of course, Abu Talib will be trying to answer these perceptions. They will, of course, be written a century apart almost, and they will accept something, but they'll also reject something. So once we come to this issue of autoethnography, when we come to Abu Talib, I think many of your questions will also be raised there, and I will try and answer them, and you will try to answer them in your own ways. Now, Tasnova has come up with a question. She's read Deen Muhammad's 1794 text. I congratulate you, Tasnova. It's a fascinating text which has been a subject of my interest for a long time, which tells about the West from an immigrant's point of view. Yes, you see, Deen Muhammad had this very interesting, was this very interesting man who served in the East India Company and later on came to Ireland, from where he came to London, and he established the first Hindustani coffee house where you could have Chilean tobacco for a penny. Now, Deen Muhammad, of course, talks about these various episodes. Now, there's one episode which I immediately recollect. And Deen Muhammad, of course, is talking about this, the European ways in which they kind of denigrate the Hindu and the Muslim shrine. And there's this European soldier who sort of urinates upon the fakir's tomb, which is supposed to be holy. And he tries to prove his sort of bravado and the fact that all Indians are superstitious. And he immediately, in a few weeks, dies. And then Deen Muhammad talks about the superstitions that the Europeans have, and how, there is no need, or there is it is absolutely reprehensible to sort of completely, ignore and castigate the local customs and religions. So in that sense, that is a moment when Deen Muhammad is acutely conscious of his Indian identity, and he's using, a kind of an autoethnography suggesting that, Europeans have their own superstition, and therefore when they sort of denigrate Indian superstition, it is something which is paradoxical. Abu Talib, of course, will be doing a lot of this autoethnography. So when we'll come to that, we will talk about it later on. Right. And then Tasnova says it could be an example of discovering the West from the point of the view of the other, of course. And that is what Abu Talib and Rabindranath, of course, does. Rabindranath, when he goes to Europe, and Dipankar will be discussing this with you if he has not already started it, he will be talking about his supposition that the West is a paradise of freedom, and the Western Parliament is something where almost every day, great debates are done. And he finds that, Western Parliament is a place where people shout at one another. The Irish are shouted down. So his idea of the West is severely challenged, and uh, and then he talks about, of course, Rabindranath then sees how Western women can step into the public sphere, and he accepts that. So it's not one of complete rejection always. It's often a kind of an acceptance, also some form of challenge which is thrown out. So the Indian perspective, or the colonized perspective, the autoethnographic perspective, is something which is very complicated. Now, when he uses the travel narrative, he's using a Western form. But within that Western form, these questions of challenging and sort of coming into a kind of a negotiation with the colonizer is something that is very important. And we shall be looking at it in far greater detail. I thank you for your questions. Obviously, these terms have have percolated down to a large extent. I will circulate the text by Pratt so that you can take a look at the terms yourselves. Said's Orientalism is, of course, part and parcel of your syllabus, so there's no point in my circulating it. But please remember that the first 2 chapters of Orientalism, something which you should be reading, should have read. If you have not, please read it by now, and read it immediately, and please read the introductory chapter of Pratt, which will be sent to your group. Right. It's been a long, winding lecture, but I've covered a lot of theoretical ground today. Now, I will expect that you will get back to this lecture and try and once again go through it, read the texts, so that by the time when we come to Abu Talib, you are prepared with these terms, because I'll be using them very frequently, these terms like contact zone, autoethnography, transculturation, and so on and so forth. Right. It is with that then that I would like to close today's presentation. Tomorrow we'll talk about a very important question that Madhurima has raised, a question about gendering travel writing and the negotiation between travel writing and gender. Thank you once again for your enthusiastic participation, and look forward to seeing all of you tomorrow.